Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to ENT318, leveraging a cloud policy framework from zero to well-governed. So as I was doing my dry run, I looked at this title, and it's kind of not clear what I'm going to talk about, so I'm going to give an explanation. So I'm assuming from the title, if you're interested, you're probably all AWS users. And just from a show of hands, I'd like to understand, how many of you are, by show of hands, running business-critical workloads in the cloud at AWS? And just, if you keep your hands up, how many of you know, if you know, how many of you are running more than 1,000 resources, like instances, ELBs, API gateways? How many of them are running 10,000? 100,000? OK, thanks. So if you're like us or a lot of other companies that landed on the cloud, when you deploy your first application, whether you build a cloud-native application or you migrate something, you manage your resources like pets. And I'll give you a story about how we started. So when I joined Cloud Health, we had literally a very basic web application. So we had one ELB. We had 2 instances running web servers. They were literally called Web 0 and Web 1. They were M1 smalls. And we had a database on C1 Medium. And we knew exactly what our entire cloud infrastructure was. We knew the instances. We knew they were the right size. We needed 2 web servers just for failover. We knew that the database was a single point of failure. We knew the security groups. We knew what ports were open. We knew our cost per month. And we bought an RI for our C1 Medium when we thought it made sense. And it was tightly managed and governed. But if your business is successful like ours was, and that strategy doesn't scale very far. Managing pets doesn't scale very far. And if you ask me today the same questions, first of all, I couldn't answer the same questions without looking at something. And secondly, I couldn't even tell you the number of instances we have to within even probably 200. So as you scale up your infrastructure, you have to adopt a different strategy in order to get to a high level of governance. And that's kind of, Cloud Health works with a lot of large AWS customers at scale. And what I've done is taken together lessons and best practices that we've learned from managing very large environments and put together a framework to enable governance at scale. So if this is what you're interested in, you stick around. If it's not, and you want to take a minute to go, step out and find a better talk, I'm totally not going to be offended. So before I dive in, just some intro. Clouded Technologies is a 5-year-old fast-growing tech company. We are headquartered in Boston. We have offices around the globe. We are in a space called cloud service management, which is the management of infrastructure and applications in one or more cloud environments. And we provide companies with a single pane of glass of governance to manage very dynamic and heterogeneous cloud infrastructure. And a lot of our users also use multiple other tools to manage their environment. We don't necessarily replace any of them. We integrate with them, and we bring that data in. We give them a higher level of visibility, recommendations for optimizations, and governance. So we have over 1,500 customers, and through direct and through a partner channel, actually 2,000 customers total. And as I said, we're a market leader in this space, and we manage over $4 billion of AWS spend, annualized spend. So we see a lot of different kinds of usage in AWS. So who are our customers? This slide gives you a glimpse into some of them. They span a number of different verticals. And they're global. Some of them are multinationals. And while we have a lot of small and medium customers, some of the largest customers here are some of the best-known names, well-known names in public cloud infrastructure. They have tens of petabytes of storage. They have tens of thousands of VMs in the cloud. And so our platform helps them manage all these complex deployments. And we've learned a lot through some of these engagements. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about. And secondly, not just that, but as I said before, we deploy our own application in AWS. And our own footprint has grown by 3 or 4 orders of magnitude in the last 5 years. And so we have both first and second-hand experience in kind of managing this growth. So just to set some context, just what to expect from this session. I'm going to frame the problem that we're going to address and talk through how we think it should be addressed through a policy-based management framework. And one of the key pieces that I'm going to talk about is how do you capture your policies as code, and what's the benefits of doing that. I'm going to go walk through a few examples across a few range of concerns, and then we'll wrap up with some actions that you can take to get started. So to set some context, so I used to work at an infrastructure company many years ago, and provisioning resources was a long process. It kind of started with planning and justification and budgeting, and then you got your servers, you racked them, you got them configured, you got it accessible through on the network, and it rightfully took weeks and months. And what AWS has done by defining a public cloud is completely blown away, disrupted that model and blown it away, right? It made resources accessible through APIs, so developers and application developers and operations could launch it in seconds. And if you wanted to scale your workload and you wanted thousands of cores, it was immediately available at your fingertips, and you got consumption-based pricing, so you only paid for what you needed, right? And what this did was it unlocked innovation in organizations and pretty much irrevocably changed how IT delivers business value. Right? So within our customer base, we have a number of examples of customers who were not born in the cloud, but who have evolved to take advantage of this paradigm shift. Like we have Capital One, Expedia, Warner Brothers, Cox Automotive, household names. These customers have transformed how their business leverages IT. So when you look at the cloud landscape, there's a couple of things happening, a couple of levels of changes happening. One is if you look at the rollout of new services from AWS, it just kind of keeps accelerating, right? It's kind of over 100 now. And like if you heard Andy Jassy's keynote yesterday, last year they had 1,000 major service updates. This year they're on track for 1,300, and you bet next year is going to be much higher than that. Secondly, even if you look at your cloud infrastructure from and you compared it to a pre-cloud era, before the cloud, if you deployed an application, it would be pretty static. It wouldn't change for weeks or months, right? And today, that's not the case. The change is, it changes at many orders of magnitude faster. So if you look just for us, that's for ourselves, we have an analytics workload that takes AWS cost and usage data and processes it for our customers. And in order to do that in a timely fashion, we have an auto-scaling capability that flexes to potentially to 10 times the baseline, right? And before the cloud, that would not have been possible. We would have to specify, how much resources we wanted at max, and be happy with that, or give users, our customers, an experience that they wouldn't want, right? So, and if you look at where things are going with containers and serverless infrastructure, change is not going to be on the order of minutes. It's going to be on the order of seconds and sub-seconds, right? So this pace of change is really accelerating. Excuse me. So if you take advantage of these new services and excuse me, and scale your AWS infrastructure, the pre-cloud way of managing your infrastructure doesn't work anymore. So infrastructure itself has changed, and the way that we need to manage them needs to have a more thoughtful, deliberate approach to governance. So governance is a little bit of a kind of a generic term, so I kind of tried to define what I mean in this context. It's the people, criteria, processes, and tools to ensure secure, effective, and efficient use of IT resources. And what efficient means is, all your cloud resources are well utilized while delivering secure, available, highly performant applications to your customers. And effective means that your investment in IT resources, whether it's time or money or people, is aligned to your business goals. And more often than not, what we find is users try to address this growth by throwing people at the problem. And as organizations scale, this becomes error-prone and very expensive, generally untenable. And people can only go kind of, there's a limit to how much you can grow with people. And it's very difficult. And it's only going to get worse. The gap gets worse. So our premise is that this gap needs to be addressed not with labor, but with automation backed by good processes. And for the rest of this session, I'll talk about how do you make it real, right? So once you buy into the premise of technology and not labor, there are a few things you have to consider. You can't improve your governance posture without measuring it. So the first thing is to have some monitoring in place. And this is not your traditional operational monitoring. It's tracking resources which reflect your effectiveness and efficiency of your cloud infrastructure. It could be things like the cost of your cloud. It could be your security compliance metrics. It could be your resource utilization metrics. It could be your RI coverage percentage, right? So you need to measure these continuously and also track them over time so that whatever actions you take, you know that you're making continuous improvement. You need to be able to know what rules you're going to manage your cloud by, right? And how is it aligned to your business? You need to have a policy-based management approach and manage by exception, not by going in and looking at reports every day and data every day. You need to have some good processes in place to drive governance. This can be an incremental approach. So you can say, if depending on your organization, you can do address cost optimization first or security first, if that's what all the stakeholders in your company can agree on really easily. Start with something that you can get agreement on. And then you have to automate the workflow. But you shouldn't do this before you do these two steps. Before you know what you want, what your criteria are, and before you have good processes, don't automate bad processes. And lastly, if you tune your rules to improve continuously, look to adopt best practices from others. And there are many that AWS publishes a bunch of best practices and recommendations on how to have how to build a great cloud application. And there's a number of guidelines available in the security space to improve your posture, to achieve compliance that you might want, or to manage business risk, right? And Cloud Health also publishes, based on our experience with thousands of customers, we publish a bunch of recommendations and best practices in terms of the policies you should consider, not follow, because it depends on your business. These are the practices that you should consider while driving governance. So if you look at achieving governance, it's not a single step to get there. It's a journey that we kind of broke it down into 4 phases here, and everybody kind of starts at adoption. You adopt the cloud, whether it's and adoption at this stage doesn't mean you're not a cloud expert. You could be an expert at all the services that you're using, and your application could be well implemented and achieve every objective that it has. But there are some criteria that I'm going to talk about in terms of what defines which phase you're in and how do you go from one to the other. And as I go through this, you might want to consider where your organization is or where your application might be and how you might go up this pyramid. So in the adoption phase, you might have a fully deployed application, but you might have unpredictable AWS expenses. You have fewer security standards, you have lack of automation, you have limited monitoring, you have no cost optimization, and you have little or no use of elasticity in this phase. And you can go to the next phase, to a scaling phase where you add more workloads, and what you probably need to do at this point is to get some visibility into your usage and your inventory and your cost, and adopt at least some very basic cost optimizations like RIs if EC2 is your biggest spend. When you're in the scaling phase, you might have a lot of workloads, but your ROI might be unclear. You might not be sure of which business unit or group is driving up the cost. You have very little change control. Things happen without you knowing. And there's little to no understanding of which workloads you're operating and how they align to business. So to get from scaling to a well-managed cloud, one of the things you need to do is kind of align your cost to your business, and then put in some policies in place to remove unused infrastructure, to tighten security, to leverage elasticity, some very basic stuff to get to a well-managed cloud. And this is not a bad place to be. The only thing that's missing at this stage is that you're unsure of, are your workloads in their best configuration? Do you have do you have a standard architecture in place? You might not have continuous optimization in place. You might drift out of your optimal state unless you have, you go back and do something manually. And to get from management to governance, a well-governed state, what you need to do is standardize workloads, do some continuous monitoring, automated optimization. You need to put some roles in place, people and roles in place to drive that governance so that it's done continuously. It's not as and when the organization does it. And when you're a fully governed state, basically, you have full transparency of your cloud usage and cost. You have reference architectures for all your workloads. You have documented policies in place in terms of how your cloud is running. You have continuous monitoring. You have automated optimization. There's clear roles and responsibilities, and all your workloads are highly available, reliable, and secure. Right? This is where you want your cloud to be. So how do you drive your organization up this pyramid? So this kind of one slide is like, this kind of captures, if there's nothing else you take away, this is the slide you need to kind of look at, which is governance is a balance between the agility that drives innovation and the control that your business needs to manage risk, right? And the strategy that we've kind of found works well with large enterprise customers is one of decentralized management, where users and groups are free to use their own tools and processes to launch resources and use what they need to do, but also centralized governance, which kind of enforces some rules and make sure everybody kind of is compliant with those rules. So we do the governance kind of top down. And how do you do that? So the need for pressing governance, the lack of governance has become a need that organizations have identified, and they've kind of focused on a role that's focused on governance called a cloud steward, right? And it's variously been called cloud custodian or a cloud manager in different places. And what this person is a champion for driving centralized governance in an organization. And if you have a larger organization, there's another option. It's what Gartner calls a Cloud Center of Excellence, which Stephen Orban kind of advocated when he was CIO at Dow Jones. And what this is a cross-functional team of developers, sysadmins, security, finance, database admins. And what their focus is on improving the effectiveness of cloud infrastructure for an organization. And so if you have a team, in addition, the team can be a little bit more hands-on. In addition to evangelizing and institutionalizing policies, they can also help with kind of evaluating tools and selecting tools and doing, helping teams achieve governance. So in either case, whether you go with a single person or a team, the key is to empower this role to drive the changes needed to achieve governance. So just by a quick show of hands, how many people have this role already in their organization right now? Yeah, that's quite a fair bit. Interesting. So the cloud steward is responsible for making sure that all the operators and stakeholders are bought into the strategy. She'll make sure that all the teams and departments have the data that they need, have the information that they need to kind of comply with the policies, to know when they're in violation of it, and also what actions do they need to do to get back in compliance. So once you know what you're driving towards, you need to think about tooling from two different points of view. One is to know what policies you have in place, where are they captured, what's the history of them, how they're changing. Right? And I'm going to talk about this concept of governance as code that helps in our policy framework. That's the concept that helps address this issue. And the second one is data integration. Whatever tools you use need to have access to the data that you want to write these rules on. So, and these don't stay in one place. It could come from your cloud, where you need to get your inventory and your configuration, and you need a place where you need to find your cost. You might have New Relic or Datadog for your performance data. You might have Ansible or Chef where your configuration data is. You might have your budget data in your internal finance system. But you need all these data somewhere in one place to write rules against all of these so that you can govern your cloud. And so this is a key piece that you need to keep in mind. So once you have all the data and you can evaluate your environment against them, you need to drive change to bring it back into compliance if it's not, in order. So with decentralized management, each team needs to know what the appropriate response is for, for anything. And having this standard operating procedure codified as an integrated runbook is probably the easiest and most efficient way to do this. But as you scale your footprint to like thousands and tens of thousands of resources, you need some level of automation. And what we find is it's usually a two-step process that users adopt. The first is when they take the trigger from the policy management system and the response, here's the standard response, and they push it to a workflow management system. It could be Jira, it could be ServiceNow, and they use their existing approval processes to execute and authorize and execute these things. And they gauge, and once they know that these responses are appropriate and they incrementally gain confidence, then you can let the policy management system autonomously execute and just basically just post back or report back the actions that it took because it was in violation. And last but not the least, you need reporting at a couple of different levels. So the most basic level is you need operational view for the teams that are running the cloud. They need to know what policies they are violating and what actions they need to take, and somewhat in real time, not down to the seconds, but probably minutes and hours. You also need to know from an organizational point of view at two levels. One is at an executive level, how's the entire organization doing, and also from individual business units, which ones have which policies in place and how well are they doing, so you can focus on the ones, engage with the ones that need it and close the gaps and make sure everybody's kind of coming forward. So let's talk about tooling a little bit more. So Amazon has kind of a bunch of critical building blocks that they've built over the last 5 years that essentially underpin any capability to drive governance. And if you're not familiar with these services, you should be, which is, so AWS Config is what gives you inventory and configuration history. Config rules are a way of, it's an asynchronous way of identifying non-compliance with desired state. And Amazon also ships what they call managed config rules, which are like best practices that they publish. CloudTrail is your audit trail. It tells you every operation that has happened in the cloud, so you can kind of understand what changes are happening. CloudWatch is AWS CloudWatch itself is a performance monitor, and then CloudWatch events is a way of it's kind of under-advertised service which allows you to filter and get events when changes happen in your cloud infrastructure. And AWS Lambda is the task execution engine in AWS. If you want to take an action to respond to anything that happened, that's the place to go do it. There was this really cool talk last year at reInvent. I think it was on a Friday morning, so I don't know how many people kind of stayed around for it. It was by the product manager for the AWS Management Tools team. And what he did was he put together, he did a little demo, a really powerful demo of putting all these tools together for governance to respond to, I think it was like an intrusion detection kind of demo that they showed. It was a really cool example. It's probably on YouTube. You can go look at it. There's also open source tools, and I picked one here, which is Cloud Custodian. It's from Capital One. It builds itself as a rules engine for AWS fleet management. You write your config rule as YAML, and it integrates with CloudWatch and Lambda to go execute them in real time and take action. So even if you don't use it, take a look at it. If you don't use it as a building block, it might give you some inspiration. And no matter what you do, if you build something, it is a continued commitment. You have to kind of keep track of all the services that Amazon's shipping. You need to integrate with data and your other workflow management systems. So it's not to be taken lightly. And lastly, in terms of commercial alternatives, somewhat unsurprisingly, like there's a number of tools in the security space, a number of very sophisticated tools. They enable monitoring, they do compliance reporting and governance. And if security is your primary focus, one of these tools might work well for you. There's also vendors that support policy-based management across broader concerns, and our company, Cloud Health, is one of them. If you want to come by the booth floor, we can show you what we can do in the product. So this is actually, it's a bad title. It's less of challenges and more of questions to think about. And we talked about data integrations, extensibility to workflow management systems. If you do build your own tools, like maintainability of the code just to make sure it's current with whatever Amazon ships, an ability to capture all your business rules, and adopt best practices, either things if you built or shared within your organization or from outside the organization, like AWS or other places. And the ability to customize for multiple targets. So this is kind of interesting. So one of the lessons we learned, like from enterprise cloud infrastructure, it's not homogeneous and cannot be governed by a single set of rules. So I'm going to walk through a couple of dimensions in the next couple of slides to highlight kind of the concerns that come up when you try to drive governance across an organization. So if you think about this, like this is kind of an environment-based segmentation for like a SaaS vendor. Like you might have a production environment, a staging, a QA, and a research environment. And you can't run all of these environments by the same rules. So production is typically the most expensive, it's the most sensitive, and it's the one that gets the most attention, right? So if you think about it, you want to do multiple things in your production environment. You want to keep track of your costs. You want to make sure it's not going up really high. You have to track that, whether it's, and one way we do that is by looking at your daily cost or your weekly cost and make sure that it stays within a range. You also want to make sure that whatever cost you do have, even if it's stable, it's well optimized. So if you're spending a lot of money on on-demand usage in EC2, it's an easy decision to, you have to identify that, and you have to make sure that, my on-demand, my ratio of on-demand to total is, less than 10%. So, and you want to make sure you have a policy in place that, if you have drift and more workloads come in, that you get notified, and there's either automatic purchase or somebody goes in and makes a purchase, and it doesn't go on for like 2 or 4 or 8 weeks before you realize that. You also want to make sure that your resources are well utilized, so that people are not, so the teams are not provisioning oversized resources for the workloads they're running. And definitely because these are, this has sensitive data, you want to make sure your access controls are tight and your data security policies are also well in place. But if you look at these policies that you might apply to your production infrastructure, they're totally not appropriate for other ones. So if you're somebody doing research and all you want to do is kind of use some tools and get some data and analyze it, and you have to jump through hoops to get to your own S3 bucket because that's those are the rules in place, it's going to stifle innovation. It's going to be very, very frustrating. Right? Same with staging. Staging, for example, for us, staging is a very variable workload. So we don't care if it goes up and down a lot, but we do care it has a budget. Like staging gets used when when there's more features that get released in a particular month, and developers need multiple staging environments. There's a budget for the month, and we track it. For us, we track that budget, and we say, as long as you don't go over your budget, it doesn't matter what other policies are in place. And again, QA is another environment where, the other policies don't work. Our QA environment is very automated. When somebody checks in code or merges a branch, a test cycle kicks off and it finishes in 30 minutes. And really, the only policy we have in place there is to say that, if you have resources running for more than 4 hours, then just notify somebody, because that's not right. That shouldn't be happening in a QA environment. But even along this one dimension, if you just look at production, right? So what you realize is production is not homogeneous. In our enterprise customer environment, they typically have multiple workloads, and it's not uncommon to find customers who have who have multiple acquisitions running multiple different, they run them as different business units, and they have multiple different applications that were already leveraging AWS, and they're running under different policies. So for example, they might have different budgets, right? And even though they might have some level of access control and data security policies. So in this case, let's make up some examples here. So BU1 is a legacy application, right? And we care about you might care about the spend not changing too much. As long as it's stable and the data is secure and access is tightly governed, that's a well-managed environment. And BU2 is a fast-growing application. So instead of knowing what the rate of spend is, you just want to make sure that the resources that you've allocated are well utilized. You don't really care as much about the spend going up because that's a growing business. But you might want to think about optimizing your costs so that this fast-growing cost is well managed. And BU3 might be kind of maybe a new acquisition that you just brought in and you have no policies in place yet, just the basic stuff, and you might incrementally roll out new things. But as you see, just across these two dimensions, right, you need to be able, if you pushed out one set of policies for everybody, you're going to get a lot of pushback from the teams that are operating the cloud. So you need to think carefully about how to target these policies in ways that make sense. We talked about the policies that and I kind of promised kind of going over best practices. And what we've done is we work with thousands of customers over many years, and these are the set of we've taken a bunch of policies that make sense and categorized into put into 6 categories. There's literally hundreds of rules under here. I'm just going to go over it to give you a sense of what these categories mean. So financial management policy and cost optimization policies typically look at your running cost. So the financial ones, you might look at your budget and see if you might have policies in place to identify if you're going to blow your budget. You might do it at a global level at your entire enterprise, or you might do it at a business unit level. You might also look at things like what's my rate of spend? Is it going up or down? And that might be difficult sometimes. You might, it might because of variability in workloads and everything else. But it's also, you might also look at, rate of change of spend in a particular service, for example, like a snapshot service shouldn't be growing at 20%. So it's an interesting example that, from our history, which is we had a customer who was a SaaS vendor. They had in the cloud, they had a pod per customer, and for each pod, they had a snapshot. They used to snapshot every EBS volume, and they used to delete the volume after 6 months. And they deployed a change in their application, and the script that did the cleanup didn't do its job, and the cost for EBS snapshots went up I think 5x what it should have been before they identified it, because it was kind of hidden inside a lot of other costs. So the ability to write a policy on just EBS cost being within a range or changing within a certain percentage is really critical at that point, because that's how you want to govern your business. Cost optimization policies. So these are ones where you would identify on-demand usage that might be eligible for RI purchases, for example. So the way you would do this is by looking at your instances that look at the a number of on-demand hours an instance runs in a month, and if it's more than 400 hours or 500 hours, you might decide that these are eligible for RIs. And if you have this automated policy in place, you can get notified of these workloads changing and go back and look at it. So operational governance, this is a way in which, this is a way in which you would identify changes in your environment. So for example, and also make sure that you don't have unused infrastructure lying around. So for example, you could write policies to identify EBS volumes that have been detached for more than 2 weeks, for example, because they're not being used anymore. Or EC2 instances that have less than 2% max CPU over a month. Or disassociated elastic IP addresses, or EBS snapshots greater than 1 year. There's a lot of waste. Even when we kind of onboard some very sophisticated customers, there's always some places, if you don't have the governance and the tools in place, it's always the case that there's always waste in the cloud. It's very difficult at scale to find these things. Performance management policies, so these are about kind of making sure the resources that you have are the right size for the workload. So do you have instances with the right CPU memory and disk for specific workloads? So do you have the right volumes in place for your elastic block store? We find that especially EBS, right? People who are running IO1 volumes, like 80 to 90% of the use cases for IO1 volumes can be satisfied by GP2. And it's a really easy check to kind of, if you have the metrics data, to make that determination. That's usually super expensive. Asset configuration policies. So this is another class of policies that are kind of critical. One important one that people might want to keep an eye on is if you use tagging to assign ownership, right? It might be really important to know that you have resources that have been launched without tags. And this is a really easy policy to put in place. If an asset is launched and doesn't have tag after 10 minutes, then either notify something or start a different workflow to kind of terminate it. You could also have you could have other corporate policies in place, like production instances should run a specific set of AMIs, or production instances should not be running outside VPCs. These are rules that you can put in place from your inventory and your configuration. And last but not least, I'm not going to go too much into security and incident management. You can manage your IAM, you can manage network controls, application security. One key one that, even if you do nothing else, the one key one that you should probably keep in mind here is making sure CloudTrail is turned on for all regions, for all accounts, in any account that you care about, because that's really critical, whether it's to know beforehand something happens or to do postmortem analysis. It's really critical to know that. So, given that these are the rules, this is just like a sampling of this. We have in our full suite, we have like hundreds, maybe even thousands of rules that you need to check against. And each one is basically a very simple rule, right? Each policy is a very simple thing. If you look at it, all it is what data are you operating on, a clearly defined condition that you want to evaluate. And once it evaluates to true or false, you want to say what actions do you want to take. And so the condition can be either way. It can be a desired state or it can be anomalous. So we in our model, we use anomalous conditions. So if anomalous, then take action. So it's easier to read that way. So the action that you would take if you're in violation of your policy. And if you look at these pieces and how they fit together, you have multiple data streams from all your integrations coming in. You write your rule against each policy is a rule. You write your rule against that data set, and you define your trigger. When do you want to execute this? And once you execute this, you evaluate the condition, this data against this rule, and if it's true, you run a set of actions. It's a very basic execution flow for this policy. But if you peel it back one layer, it gets a little bit more complex. So if you look at data sources, there are multiple different kinds of data sources. You can have your cloud data coming in from cloud APIs. You can, as I said, you can have it coming from your configuration management system. You might need history for some of these assets, because if you go to AWS, you don't know what was running last week. So if you want to do a baseline against what are the changes, you need to kind of keep track of it. And you also need an ability to do some synthesized attributes. So for example, if you want to know what the cost of an instance for the last hour was, you need to cross-reference the size, if it's an EC2 instance, with the pricing table. And that's just what the list price should have been. What's your actual price comes from your billing data, right? So you need to know what's my average cost for my instance for the last month. You have to process a lot of data to get that. It's not a simple API call to go do that. And Cost Explorer recently announced an API to get cost data. So before that, it was really difficult to get any cost information directly out of AWS. You had to do some work in order to be able to get that information. So this can get even more complicated. So I kind of mentioned something like, when you look at budgets, you don't want to look at your cost. You want to look at your projected monthly cost for the month, right? And that's an analysis. You have to do that analysis somewhere, even if you're getting that data out of your cloud. So metrics data is very different from that. It's timestamped, it has higher volume and velocity. And there are things you might want to do with metrics. There are aggregations you want to do. You want to kind of find min, max, average. You might want to do percentiles against them. And whatever machinery you have in place needs to be able to support doing this very efficiently. And then there are events, which are just like what things are happening in the cloud. So CloudTrail is an example of a source of events. And, but these are semantically well-structured and interpretable, and log streams are just data that come in that need some level of analysis to make them usable. So there's different kinds of data that you need to plug into your policy engine in order to make it useful. So if you look at triggers, triggers define when your policy runs, when your rule runs. It could be based on a schedule. You could say check every 15 minutes, or you could say check at 6 a.m., or you check on Mondays, right? You define when you want to run. If you want to check your weekly cost, you might do it on a Monday morning just before you come into the office, so you kind of have that report in place. It could be event-based. You could say something like, when an EC2 instance is launched, check to see if it has a tag, right? You want to do it right away, immediately, as soon as the event fires. Or it could be state-driven. You could say things like, state or delay-driven. You could say things like, as I said, like my QA instances, right? If my QA resource is running for more than 4 hours, so you want to do it 4 hours after some point. So it gets a little complicated. The rules are really simple. You just want to take the data. When the trigger fires, you want to evaluate some logic against your input data. And you can have composite conditions and clauses. It's necessary, but it's pretty straightforward to go do this. And lastly, once your policy evaluates to true, what do you want to do with it? You want to have a library of actions that you can kind of pick and choose what you want to do with it. And some of these are, get a little complicated because it's parameterized. You want to say, you don't want to define different actions every time you want to send a notification. You want to say, email the owner of the asset, and the owner of the asset is defined by a tag, a specific tag that you might have defined, right? So you want to be able to do this in a parameterized fashion, not be able to write code for every time you do. You might have 150 groups for 150 different owners. You don't want to individually manage that. So this is the piece where this is the concept that I kind of talked about earlier, which is if you think like about 8 or 9 years ago, there was this kind of impedance mismatch between developers and operations in terms of kind of the environment in which you want to deploy an application and whose responsibility was it to manage it. And it was this principle of infrastructure as code which kind of drove the DevOps movement that kind of bridged this impedance mismatch, right? And what we're proposing is governance as code, which captures your entire policy, all the units that I kind of talked about earlier, into one place in a way that you can read and interpret, kind of gives you a framework in which you can kind of talk about governance across multiple stakeholders in the organization. It gives you, in our concept, it's portable, it's universal. You can take a definition. I'll kind of show you some examples of some policies as code. And you can take one of those examples and you can kind of compile it or translate it into something that Cloud Custodian could run, as long as it has access to the same data sets, right? And you can keep this as a system of record. You can track this code. You can see what was in place at what point. And it allows you to do a centralized approach. Without centralizing the definition of policies, it's only if you centralize the definition of policies you gain the economies of scale and you gain consistency. You know definitely which best practices and rules are being enforced. And you can maintain and evolve those practices in a methodical fashion, right? And you're fully auditable. At any point, you know what was in place at any point. And that's what code, having this governance as a code package gives you. So I'm going to talk about a few examples. The rest of it is really quick, which is one. So the first one is a simple one. It's a security example. It's from CIS. CIS is Center for Internet Security, which is like a third-party organization. It's well respected. They published a benchmark on managing security in AWS infrastructures. And one of the recommendations they have is ensure all credentials unused for 90 days are disabled. You can find this. They publish this as a PDF. You can go look at it. And if you look at it, I just, there's nothing. I'm just showing what the guideline is, right? It tells you, it gives you, it's a document that tells you exactly what the check is, what the rationale is. It tells you how to run the audit. It's a multi-step process, and then what the remediation should be. And if you want to capture this as code, this is what it is. A little bit of eye chart. I'm going to jump into a little bit detail here, which is you look at it. So the first one is this is our kind of model of it, which is a little bit. There's a couple of headers that capture identity. It tells you, it has a name and it has a source. So if you're sharing it with other people, it's uniquely identifiable. There's a section that is free form for documentation that if you want to integrate it with runbooks, you can kind of capture that information there. But the key piece is there are 4 elements, which are the input, trigger, rule, and action. So the input for this one is you want to look at your AWS access keys, right, from IAM. So that's the set of assets that we want to look at. And the trigger is, and I just kind of made this up, check twice a day, 6 o'clock morning and 6 o'clock in the evening. And the check is if the last use date is more than 90 days, right? And last use is an attribute of the access key in our model. And because it's a date, you can apply a function saying age in days and apply an operator saying, what's the threshold you want. And as you can see, this is kind of fairly readable. You don't have to go into Python or Go code. This is something that's shareable across your organization. Somebody can look at it and say, yes, I understand what that's doing. In this case, it's really simple, but you can think about much more complex rules where kind of mapping it into a more readable fashion kind of makes it really useful. And then the action is, in this case, it's run a Lambda function and pass it a parameter, which is the access key, pass the ARN, and it would disable the access key. The second example is, so Amazon kind of publishes something called a well-architected framework. It comes from the experience of solution architects. They've taken the experience with thousands of customers in building cloud applications, and they've kind of published guidelines and best practices. It's kind of broken down into 4 pillars. How many people here are familiar with the framework here? Yeah, a lot of you. So there are 4 pillars. It's kind of broken down into, I think, performance, reliability, security, and cost optimization. And I just picked a random one from reliability, which is making sure your resources are spread across multiple regions of AZs. So again, they have a very descriptive document that tells you exactly what these guidelines are. So I'm going to pick one of these, which is ELB. And I'm going to skip over the headers. So the input here is your asset information, which is your Elastic Load Balancers. The trigger is check every 15 minutes. I could have very well said check whenever an ELB changes, but it's just kind of a demo. And then the rule is that make sure that it either has multiple AZs or multiple VPC subnets, right? That's the rule that makes sure that the resources connected to this ELB are distributed geographically. And then the action here is, basically, I said, notify me and the asset owner. So this particular one is basically just a hard-coded, just a name. And this one is a reference to the owner of the asset. So it correctly routes it to both, if you want to send this notification to a central governance team and the owner of the assets, it's easy to go do. The third one is a little more custom. So this one, the example here is, I'm looking at underutilized instances. But I don't want to, there's a lot of underutilized instances. I don't care about all the T2 micros and the kind of M3 mediums. Those are like, 10 cents an hour. I really care about the expensive ones. So the example here that I'm kind of trying to put together is anything that has less than 50% CPU utilization but costs more than $1 an hour, right? So the data that comes in is EC2 instances. And the trigger is I'm checking once a week. And the rule is that, and this is where the heterogeneous data sets come in, right? The rule is check to make sure my hourly cost is greater than $1 and my CPU utilization at 95th percentile over the last 7 days is less than 50%. And that's the description of the rule, and that's the rule, right? So that's a really powerful, I mean, if you think about it, like you can customize these things, you can let business units and the operators who are running services define what good utilization for services, right? Because good utilization for a Redis server is not the same as a good utilization for a Postgres server, for example. So, that was the 3 examples. So once you have all your governance as pieces of code, it enables a lot of benefits. So the first key thing is, you can start writing this code in small pieces and evolve it. You can put it in, you can manage it like any code. You can use it in you can put it in version control, you can share it, you can track who makes changes to it, and if you make a mistake and you want to roll back, you can do that too. You can, if you put it in version control, you can share it with other units in your organization, or if you have a community and you want to build a community and share it across the organization, you can put best practices in a way where it's easily interpretable by multiple people. So the last piece of, once you have your policy engine and your governance as code in place, the last piece is kind of measuring success, how you're reporting on your governance, and I kind of talked about this a little bit. There's 3 levels to it. You want to make sure that whatever framework you have in place keeps track of kind of what happened at what time, so that people have a way of going back and kind of rationalizing what happened, and also tracking history. Like you might want to know that this happened 6 times last week, but guess what? It happens 20 times the week before, so we're improving at this point. You also want business unit level reporting, so you kind of know that kind of the leaders in the organization get a sense of how well their teams are complying with given policy, and what is remaining, how much work is remaining, how much it's going to impact their workload. And the last one is basically at an enterprise level, you kind of want to know how well is the organization as a whole doing in ensuring governance for effective and efficient utilization of your cloud infrastructure. So to recap, how do you get started? So one is kind of, and I think I kind of went through all of this, kind of recapping it, which is establish your strategy by which you want to do it. And as I said, centralized governance, decentralized management seems to work. Define your policies that you want, capture them as code. Adopt best practices, either build your own or share with the community, or take it from advisors. And you have to automate the evaluation of policies at scale. It's easy to do, otherwise at small scale, but doesn't work really at big scale. And start incrementally and become more aggressive in remediation over time. And then, it's a matter of tuning. It's a matter of doing single steps at a time and improving over time. And that you can only do that by tracking the metrics that you have in place. So that's all I had. So Cloud Health is at booth 1125. You can come by to look at our policy engine. We can show you what we do today in the product and what we're working on in the future. And you can also come by to play a trivia game. It's also available online. So thank you. I think we have like a few minutes for questions if you have any. And I'm going to be around for a while if you have more questions. Thank you.